What a wonderful book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been quite an experience.
So let me start. Um, uh, so your day job is a law professor at Georgetown. You ended up taking a couple of years as a reserve officer with the Metropolitan Police Department in DC, which is one of the few police departments, as you explained, that allows people to do that. I think you wrote that you're required to do 24 hours a month. Why did you do this?
Great question. It's the one I kept asking myself, and everybody else I knew kept asking me. I think it was curiosity more than anything else that drove this. When I found out that DC had this program where anyone can volunteer to be a police officer and go through the police academy and all that kind of stuff, and get a badge and a gun, I was just so flabbergasted. This just seemed so utterly weird. And I immediately just thought, wow, that would be fascinating. It would be totally fascinating to see what that is like. So, and that curiosity really was the single biggest thing, that it's such an opaque world, the world of policing. It's so closed to outsiders. And it seemed like an incredible opportunity to be on the inside and see what it looks like from the inside. And I, like everybody else, like every sort of average lefty wandering around, was critical of policing and so on. But I've always thought, if you want to change something, you need to understand it first. And this seemed like a pretty amazing way to understand it better.
I think a lot of people who read your book, Tangled Up in Blue, may be expecting primarily a critique of police excesses, but you've written a narrative memoir with some poignant descriptions of police encounters with everything from domestic violence to smart aleck kids annoying neighbors to people who, in a less sensitive age, would have been called just plain crazy. And I think the book will also surprise a lot of critics of policing for its compassion for cops as well as for victims of police misconduct and for the lives of poor people who encounter police much more than affluent ones.
Mhm.
What surprised you about what you found?
You know, I wouldn't say that it surprised me because I came to this having spent a lot of my time in my career doing things like interviewing people who had been victims of atrocities and torture and human rights abuses, and sometimes that meant interviewing the perpetrators. Um, and one of the things that has sort of always fascinated me, almost nobody thinks I'm a bad guy. Nobody gets up in the morning. Maybe Hitler did, I don't know. But almost nobody gets up in the morning and says, I'd like to cause suffering for some people today. I believe that there are some sadists who do that, but the vast majority of human beings get up in the morning and they want to do the right thing. They want to be able to go home and look at themselves in the mirror and feel like they did the right thing. And so I didn't expect that I was going to find a bunch of monsters. I expected that I would find a bunch of ordinary people who were themselves struggling to come up with a framing that made what they did make sense. And that's what I found. And I also found, unsurprisingly, I think we have a political culture that loves binary opposition. So depending who you ask, you ask somebody on the political right, cops are selfless, self-sacrificing heroes. You ask somebody on the political left and they're brutal racist thugs. And whenever you get that kind of binary opposition, that it's going to be a lot more complicated than that. You're going to get, I mean, the the title of the book, not only uh the song title from the Dylan song, the famous Dylan song, not only did it seem to aptly summarize my own sense of having become entangled in this complicated world of policing, but my sense that the world of policing is itself tangled, that the brutality, the racism are all tangled up with compassion and courage and good things. And you can't tease out one strand without ending up yanking on some of the others.
Do you think DC is representative? I mean, it's a city that's about half black. It's the home of a lot of white liberals. Is DC a little better than many urban police forces on
I
issues
think
of police
it is.
conduct?
Yeah. I think it is, and partly because it has a very dark history. As you probably know, in the 1980s and 1990s, the DC police force was not viewed as one of the more enlightened, progressive police departments in the country, and by the late 1990s, DC had one of the highest rates of officer-involved shootings in the country. Um, that led to a Justice Department investigation and ultimately to a memorandum of understanding between the department and between the police department in DC and the Department of Justice on changing use of force rules, changing training. And I think 2, 3 years ago, there was an independent audit to see whether that memorandum of understanding was still needed to stay in force. And the auditor concluded that DC no longer had a significant problem with excessive force.
Wow.
The department really did change. And that was my experience with the department too, was that it's not perfect. It is very far from it. And in some ways it is typical. But one of the things that I think is good about it is that it does have a lot of people in it, including in the very high ranking people who are open to change. And if you say to them, maybe you shouldn't do it that way, maybe you should do it this way, they don't say, shut up, go away. They say, let's talk about that. And that I think is a necessary thing for any organization to stay healthy.
Now, I think that agreement that you referred to was the fruit of the 1994 Crime Act, most of which was lock them up. But this was one of the few good things about it that allowed for Justice Department supervision of police departments that had to operate under court
Yeah.
supervised reform programs. I believe Trump shut that down. Um, Now Biden is in a position to start it up again. Uh, does that have enough reach to get at some of the departments where
Mm,
you've got, police unions
yeah.
protecting,
Yeah.
enforcing the blue wall of silence, and you've got really entrenched bad attitudes, not just the occasional bad apple. So, other than restarting that, what
Mhm.
else might you do structurally?
Uh, I th- I think it's a lot. I mean, I don't think there is, that one neat trick to fix policing. I think that having the Justice Department have that cudgel to wield is important. Um, I think that Congress, through the spending power, can create significant incentives for police departments all over the country. Obviously, for the most part, we don't. Policing is not, it's not centralized in this country. We have almost 18,000 different law enforcement agencies. They don't always listen to each other, which makes it in some ways a much harder nut to crack than, say, the military, which is conveniently hierarchical. So if the top level decides we're going to change something, it's a whole lot easier to disseminate that across the organization. Policing is much more piecemeal. But that said, police, like everybody else, respond to funding. And if the funding is, hey, if you do this kind of training program, not that kind of training program, the spigots will open for you and so on, that can make a pretty big difference. That's another thing. Ending qualified immunity is a third thing. And that's obviously been written about quite a lot in terms of making it easier to hold officers accountable if they engage in shootings, et cetera, aren't merely that aren't criminal necessarily, but are significant constitutional violations, et cetera. Then I think there's a lot that departments and communities can do, um, including putting pressure on departments to change the way they recruit, to change the way they train, and so forth. But then finally, and this is, I think, the really big thing, and one of the major lessons for me of the experience. And, again, something I sort of knew, but you don't really know it until you see it. By the time police officers get involved, all the choices are often bad
Right.
because the police don't work in a vacuum. They work in a legal environment, political environment, socioeconomic environment that they didn't create, and they can't do much to change. So if you look at DC, and you look at the percentage of arrests made by police in DC each year that are for pretty minor offenses, misdemeanor level offenses. And you might think, well, that's great. The police shouldn't arrest people for those things. Well, the police didn't criminalize those things, you know? we did through our elected representatives. And so much about policing is like that, that if we don't want traffic stops to be so fraught, we don't need to have armed police officers enforcing civil regulations, civil traffic regulations. We could say, hey, you guys don't stop cars unless somebody's shooting out the window. We're going to let civilians figure out how you give tickets, or you have speed cameras, or whatever you want to do. If we don't want people to be arrested for all these trivial offenses because we think it hurts communities more than it helps anybody, change the law. It's not that complicated. And cops can't do that by themselves. And if cops start just ignoring the law and not enforcing it, then they get in trouble.
Well, I think your book is also very powerful in pointing out the way that the police are entangled with all the manifestations of poverty.
Yeah.
And they often get into a situation where there are no good choices either for the person who finds him or herself tangled up with the law, or sometimes for the police. I mean, you tell a very poignant story of a black woman who gets caught for shoplifting because she doesn't have food to feed her family, and you and your partner on patrol try to figure out a way to get her some food so she doesn't have to go to jail. And then it turns out when they run her record that she's got an outstanding warrant, she has to go to jail. She might have gone to a food bank, but as Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker Movement liked to say, the poor are not just poor in money, they're poor in the choices they make. So much of police reform, it's a truism, is connected to the much deeper reforms that the society needs. Um, I was also, apropos of stopping cars, encouraged by your chapter in which you showed that most cops don't want to bother with things like expired driver's licenses or improper registrations, the kind of things that the
That may just be DC's seventh district. I don't know how generalizable that is. As you know, there are entire municipalities that get big chunks of their annual revenue from stop having police stop cars and give tickets. So I don't want to generalize too much from that. That was working in a very high crime area
right.
where dealing with traffic infractions would take up a lot of time, involved a lot of situations where you'd end up having to arrest people for trivial offenses. So I saw a lot of police officers just saying, I don't even want to go there because we're going to, every third car you stop is going to have someone with an expired license or something. We're going to have to arrest them. We have better things to do. That's crazy.
But I mean, I think your larger point here is very important, that you have a whole syndrome where Black people and young Black men in particular, if they're routinely stopped for something, they're likely to have a bench warrant out for some prior offense that they didn't have the money to pay a fine for. And then you get into this cascading horror of that ruins their life. And as you point out, a lot of smaller cities make a lot of money off of this. So what
Yeah.
what's the reform for that?
Um, what is the reform for the cities that make a lot of money off of
Well,
traffic
for
tickets,
the for the
or
for this syndrome of
yeah. So
overcriminalization leading to every
yeah,
other kid having a bench warrant, leading to ruined lives.
no, this is where it does get really tricky because and there's been some wonderful work done by a lot of different people on how the cycle of fines for civil infractions
Right.
can rapidly, for the poor, turn into summons for failing to appear or failing to pay your fine, which then can turn into summons for, criminal summons for ignoring the summons to appear for something else, which then can end up with you go to jail for what started with a traffic ticket that you couldn't pay for something absolutely trivial. And you've got someone whose life has just been, they owe thousands of dollars, their liberty is taken away for some period of time, devastating effects on their community. And it all started with something like a, right turn on red with a no right on red sign, or but that sort of cascade, I think you have to get at it at several different points, and part of it is really thinking about doing something that a couple of Scandinavian countries do, having progressive fines so that you're not giving everybody the same fine. If I get a ticket for $20, I'm annoyed, but it's not going to bankrupt me. My kids will eat. But there are a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who, if they get a ticket for $20, they don't have $20, or $20 is going to mean that there's a day where there's not enough food, Or, in some cases, yeah, they've got some other issue going on, whether it's addiction or maybe a mental health issue. That means they're not going to get it together to pay the fine, even if they have $20. That it's going to be beyond them to sort of figure out. They don't have a computer, so they can't pay it online. And they don't have envelopes and a stamp handy, so they don't have maybe they don't have a bank account, so they don't have a checkbook, and they're not supposed to send cash through the mail. There are all these barriers, whether it's the amount or the sort of bureaucratic and complex nature of all these things. It's sort of like you ever try to figure out what documents you're supposed to bring to the DMV. People with multiple PhDs can't figure it out. And then we're expecting everybody to figure it out. And this is the same. We have this incredibly convoluted, bureaucratized system that could have been designed to prevent people from actually paying any ticket they get, because it's so confusing. And changing that, having fines that are progressive, so that you, Bob, with your nice study full of books, and I with my nice house, we pay $200. But the person who is poor, maybe you link it to income taxes, pays $2 or something like that. And you can, I mean, you could get it from, let's decriminalize the things that we're criminalizing. Let's focus much more on giving warnings that are safety oriented, like saying to somebody, hey, listen, you might not have realized this, but you went right on red. Here's why it's dangerous. Off you go now. Please, please be careful. We don't really have a lot of evidence that the sort of let's go immediately to the fine helps anybody. And when you do the sort of balancing, and you think, okay, the city got $20, and that person, maybe this will help teach them not to turn right on red again at that particular intersection. But here are all these potential harms. I don't think it is worth it.
So one of your takeaways was a fellowship that you proposed, that you succeeded in having Georgetown Law School create, the Police for Tomorrow Fellowship, to change police attitudes, so that you're not just complying with the minimum requirements of the order to clean up, the department's act, but you're going beyond that. Would you tell us a little bit about that, and then also what else you would do structurally?
Yeah. So I don't so much think of it as trying to change police officers' attitudes, but one thing that really struck me as in my time as a reserve officer was that police officers get very few opportunities to talk in a sort of safe setting about all the hardest issues facing policing: race in policing, excessive force. What is policing for? How do we know what good policing looks like? Can we measure it? All these questions, and police tend to get very defensive because the protests tend to be, it's just the nature of protests, right? That when people are marching and chanting slogans and carrying signs, they don't tend to be subtle. The signs don't say things like, it's really complicated, but there are a bunch of things that could be, the signs sort of say, end racist cops or whatever. And police get very defensive, and they feel very misunderstood. And the police academy is not a place where you can have those hard conversations. Once people are out on patrol, there's even less opportunity, because everybody's busy responding to calls or doing whatever they're doing. And so we thought it would be useful to kind of create a space where cops could have those conversations and could talk to each other, and talk to community activists, talk to scholars, talk to a very wide range of people, in an atmosphere that felt like, hey, this is actually a conversation. This is not an attack. And so the program, which is in collaboration with the Metropolitan Police Department, is part of the reason that I say, it's not a perfect department, but it's a department that cares about doing better in the ways in which it's not, was very, very supportive. So they helped us identify eligible officers. They helped us make sure that those officers got time away from their routine duties to do this. They assigned them each a department mentor, so they'd have someone within the department who they could go to with career issues and so on. And they come to Georgetown for these very intensive workshops on issues like race and policing. At different workshops, we've done walking tours of historic African-American neighborhoods. We've had them meet with local high school kids. We've had them meet with activists for the rights of the homeless, all kinds of different programs. And it's really been pretty neat. And I know this sounds kind of corny, but as a teacher, um, it's pretty amazing to watch the conversations that take place. And this is the thing. This is why I say, it's not about, we brought them here so we could change their minds. It's often they're struggling themselves to, how do I make sense of this? Do I agree with that or not? Is this a good thing to do or not? And they come in with those questions and they argue with each other very passionately, and they argue with the guests that we bring in, and the conversations they have are pretty great. And in some cases, the comments they have given to senior officials in the police department as a result of those sessions have led to real changes, particularly in places such as the curriculum of the police academy has changed in some significant ways as a result of their feedback. So that's kind of exciting. And the hope is that this will both nurture a new generation of police leaders, and give rise in the near term, even while they're still junior officers, as I said, to some ideas and initiatives that can change the department from within.
Reading this, my sense was that you, as a progressive, are being rather courageous in challenging the stereotype that cops are racist. I just want to quote, you're quoting a couple of your patrol partners, and you're quoting a black officer named Auguste, who says, it has nothing to do with race. And this is in the context of politely critiquing Michelle Alexander's famous book, The New Jim Crow, which in which she treats overcriminalization of black people as the new Jim Crow. And Auguste says, it has nothing to do with race. My skin's black too. You don't see me effing people up for a few bucks. These people here, they're just messed up. It's like they like being bad, like they think being bad is good. Nothing makes these people act like they do. They don't like it here. They should fix their neighborhood or leave. And of course, as your book points out, you were assigned mostly to the poorest, toughest neighborhood in the city, I guess, Anacostia, right?
That's the southern part of Anacostia.
Southern Anacostia, and because of the larger structural forces in this society, the people there who tend to have encounters with the police, who the police experience as messed up, are almost all black.
Mhm.
So um, obviously, it's going to take a long time to remedy all of the structural horrors in the society that fall most heavily on black people. And in the meantime, how do we how do we build more alliances? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, yeah. And I think part of the reason that police officers like Auguste, who I talk about a little bit in the book, who's a black officer, looks around and he says, I'm not racist, The part of the problem is that there's no reason they would see the legacy of structural racism that has made those neighborhoods the way they are. They don't know anything about the legacy of de jure segregation that kept African Americans out of some neighborhoods and forced them into other less desirable neighborhoods because white people wanted to, take over other neighborhoods or build a new development. They don't know the history of restrictive racial covenants. They don't know the history of zoning rules that have made it hard to have supermarkets and so on in certain places, or the economic forces that mean that the kinds of stores people most need have no incentive to locate in those neighborhoods, or the reasons that the transportation network is worse in those neighborhoods, which in turn can lock people into, well, it's a lot harder to get a job if you have to take 3 buses and 2 metros to get to the places where the jobs are. So they don't see any of that. All they see is the results of several centuries of discriminatory policies. And I think part of the answer to that is obviously to start unwinding those discriminatory policies with aggressive measures to do things like say, okay, how do we make sure that the public transportation network is better in poor communities? How do we make sure that there are supermarkets that offer fresh foods and it's not just liquor stores and convenience stores that sell junk food? How do we make sure, how do we invest in building jobs, meaningful jobs within those communities so people aren't forced to travel long distances outside in order to get a decent job? Part of it is that. And then the smaller part is just for police, helping them learn about those neighborhoods. A lot of DC police don't come from the city. DC has several programs trying to encourage DC residents to go into the police department. But quite a lot of the officers come from somewhere else. They don't know the city. So, it's like they were born yesterday because they don't have any sense of the rich history or the why people react to them the way they do, why these neighborhoods are the way they are. We took our fellows to the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum, which is a great museum if you've never been there. And they have, I think it's still ongoing, actually, a fantastic exhibit um, on how DC's neighborhoods have changed and the demographics of a changing DC, with particular focus on changing, how African American neighborhoods have developed, thrived, and then often been pushed out. And we brought our fellows there, and they spent an hour with the curator talking about it, and that was really, I think people kind of came out of it saying, I think I understand more now why this is the way it is, why if somebody responds negatively to me, it's not because of something I did, it's because of a set of historical experiences, but that makes me more patient with it and less defensive about it, and so on. So that's a piece of it too.
You spend a lot of time in the book, and it's very powerful in this respect, on how it is drilled into police officers at the police academy in their training and in just day-to-day patrol experience, that you are at risk all the time, and you never know when somebody might, jump out of a closed door and kill you. And the book's also very powerful in sort of explaining that mentality as what is behind the fact that some police officers, with the adrenaline pounding when they see a toy gun, end up killing a black kid who did nothing wrong. On the other hand, you've got officers who are plainly sadistic, like the officer who killed George Floyd. And you mentioned one incident in D.C. where an officer ended up in the police academy because they couldn't trust him on the street because he was the subject of so many complaints for being abusive. Well, I guess the question is, I'm being overly binary here, but to the extent that you've got some who really are sadistic and others who just make bad decisions, how do you address both?
Well, I mean, the really sadistic ones should not be in policing, and that gets to the police union issue and the lack of a national police registry, right? So if you're a lawyer and you get disbarred, it's really easy for other states to find out that you've been disbarred. If you're a cop and you get fired for misconduct in one town, it can be extremely difficult for other places to even find that out. So often people will go from department to department, even though they've been fired for malfeasance of one form or another. So part of it, it goes back to that, sort of the overall accountability structures, and yeah, the police unions in have. I mean, I grew up standing on picket lines, and God bless unions, but police unions have not, by and large, been a force for progressive change. And I do hope that this younger generation of police officers will take over those unions and change them. But that's a whole other project. But you know, we can make it easier legislatively for departments to go after and get rid of bad officers. That's one thing we certainly should do. When it's just officers who aren't sadists, but are just doing the wrong thing because their training has been poor and so on, that's sort of more on us. I mean, as a society, it's on the police department. And I do think that there's so many causes of the high rate of police involved shootings in this country. The training that sort of emphasizes this constant sense of threat is a big part of it. It's not the only part of it, though. But changing that training, I think, can help. And because it's not just the problem with that kind of training is not just that people end up shooting other people. DC now has a pretty low rate of officer involved shooting. So, as we said at the beginning, something has worked. The training is better, but that kind of sense of constant threat can also translate into how many stops do you make? Do you think you need to stop and frisk somebody? What tone do you take with them? Do you yell at them if they move quickly? As opposed to, do you stay calm? And there's a fantastic program in Washington State. There's a woman named Sue Rahr, who's the former sheriff of King County, Washington, and now runs Washington State's Law Enforcement Academy. And she has started a program at the academy there, which places much more emphasis on communication skills, de-escalation skills, tactics to slow things down so that officers and everybody else in a situation have some time, space, distance to calm down and find ways to resolve things that don't involve use of force by anybody. Um, um, she really de-emphasizes the boot camp approach to policing. Yes, sir, get down and give me 20. And instead, it really emphasizes that recruits need to learn to have conversations with people. She also beefed up the defensive tactics training. And her argument is that a lot of the time when cops overreact and pull out a gun, it's because they're scared and they don't feel physically prepared to handle a threat without a gun. And so they reach for that gun. Whereas her argument is, look, if you simultaneously give people more training in de-escalation, communication skills, and more physical self-confidence, they're going to be a whole lot less likely to reach for that gun and a whole lot more likely to feel like, I can handle this. I can afford to stand here and chat and see if we can sort this out because I know that I can take care of myself without having to shoot somebody. And that's an example of the kind of training program that I think more cities, states should be adopting.
Do you think now, again, you're talking about DC, you're talking about King County in Washington State. Do you think in the more hardcore right-wing parts of the country, there is police sympathy for militias? Are there uh, infiltration of police department by people who believe in violence, or is that left-wing paranoia?
No, I don't think it's left-wing paranoia, but I also don't think it's accurate to sort of say the police, writ large are sympathetic to far-right militias, et cetera. I mean, police are not monolithic. Even in more red parts of the country, they're not monolithic. And I do think there is evidence that some of these far-right extremist groups, like the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters and the Proud Boys, have made deliberate efforts to recruit both within the ranks of current officers and to persuade their adherents to go into careers in policing. I think we don't really know, is that a marginal problem or is that a big problem? And we need to find that out, obviously. I mean, there are almost 800,000 sworn law enforcement officers in the United States. And we don't really know if there, 200 of them are right-wing extremists scattered across the country, in which case we're not that worried, or, 100,000 of them, in which case I'm really worried. And so I think this is an area where I think the events of January 6th were an enormous wake-up call for the whole country, that we have to be taking the threat of violent extremism from the right much more seriously. That said, I do always worry, again, because I always worry when I hear generalizations, when we say, oh, the police are just sympathetic to the far right. I think, well, no. And we saw that on January 6th. I saw plenty on Twitter and so on of people on the left saying, oh, well, the police just let them waltz right in because the police are on their side. And I think it's not impossible that a couple of those Capitol Police were sympathetic. But on the other hand, the 140 police officers who got injured, some of them very badly, and the police officer who was killed, I don't think they were on the side of that mob, and so I think we need to be really careful about that kind of generalization.
Well, I think the new Attorney General, Merrick Garland, is just about the perfect person for this job, given his whole
Absolutely. Yeah.
career dealing with domestic terrorism. Does the Justice Department have the authority to do this sort of investigation of right-wing efforts to infiltrate police or recruit police?
I don't see why they wouldn't. So I'm not an expert on that. I have a wonderful colleague at Georgetown. I actually have a couple, many wonderful colleagues, but two wonderful colleagues in particular, one of whom is an expert on right-wing, white nationalist extremist organizations, and the other of whom is an expert on Justice Department investigations into policing. These are Mary McCord, who used to be the acting, I can never remember the complicated Justice Department titles, but she was the top person in the Justice Department's National Security Division, and she specializes in looking at right-wing violent extremism. And my colleague Christy Lopez, who worked for the Civil Rights Division doing police pattern and practice investigations. She wrote the Ferguson report. And between the two of them, they would know all the ins and outs much better than I do. But I can't see a single reason why the Justice Department couldn't be taking the lead on that. And the precise authorities, I don't know. But I would encourage anybody who is listening to this to check out Christy Lopez's work and Mary McCord's work.
For my next story, I will be in touch with them. I have to ask you one last personal question. Uh, since this book is partly memoir, one of the charming things, one of the brave things you do is talk about the somewhat disapproval of the project by your mom, Barbara Ehrenreich, who I've known for roughly more than half a century. Uh, I have to ask you, did she like the book?
Yes, she did like the book. I think I think at the end she sort of came around, when she saw that this was going to create things like the program at Georgetown we created and the book itself. She eventually came around.
That's great. Well, congratulations. It's just, it's really a wonderful piece of work.
Well, thank
So
you, Bob.
uh,
Thank
stay in touch. Good
All
luck
right.
with the book.
Thank you for having me.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.